Nietzsche writes, "By no means is it possible for language adequately to render the cosmic symbolism of music, for the very reason that music stands in symbolic relation to the primordial contradiction and primordial pain in the heart of the primordial unity, and therefore symbolizes the sphere which is above all appearance and before all phenomena. Rather should we say that all phenomena compared with it are but symbols. Hence language, as the organ and symbol of phenomena, cannot at all disclose the innermost essence of music. Language can only be in superficial contact with music when it attempts to imitate music, while the profoundest significance of the latter cannot be brought one step nearer to us by all the eloquence of lyric poetry." Do you agree with this statement that of all the arts and sciences, that music comes closest to potentially disclosing the primordial unity of being?
Well, it's one of the least concrete things we experience.
Well, its advantage over language is our response to it isn't first conceptual.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, you don't have language to limit the experience.
Right. But would you say that that's not true about three-dimensional art, or for that matter, dance?
I can't. For me, the thing about music resonates because that's always been the most impressive experience to me, apart from certain chemicals one might ingest.
You were saying a few weeks ago, Larry, something about rhythm being unity.
Yes.
Rhythm doesn't exist in time, but it unifies time.
So
So
something
that's
like
pretty
that, yeah.
interesting. And
Yeah,
dance
it's an
and
imposition
poetry.
An imposition of one thing across many.
Yeah, so that's a powerful source of unity. And if you think of colors, I was saying a few weeks ago that when you put two colors together, there's that third thing of how they go with each other. But that's a lot clearer when you have a chord of music and harmony.
Yes. Even though harmony appears to be relatively recent in the history of music, which I find really surprising. It's kind of like perspective. Why did it take so long for artists to try to render perspective correctly? Not that it necessarily was a big help, but it produced some beautiful works of art.
Well, the Greeks and the Romans did it, but in medieval art, I'm not sure. I always had the impression it was because the point wasn't to make the painting look like the real world. So you'd have, for example, large figures who are larger because they were more important, not like the real world where a short person might be important.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, the meaning was more important than the medium. But I can imagine people having a kind of fluid experience visually, that's not something I relate to very well. But I wonder about things like sense of smell. It's even more ethereal, isn't it? You can't feel it vibrate.
Right.
But we don't even have much of a language for that, which maybe is a good thing.
And it's interesting that in terms of these subtle senses like taste and scent, the language usually used to describe them is the language of music. One speaks about food or a wine having a top note and then a body and then...
Yeah, they do talk like that.
Well, it's the only vocabulary they have.
Well, there's words like fruity and stuff like that.
But there's something about coming closest to potentially disclosing the primordial unity of being. That requires, I think, an individual response rather than a principial response.
Well, I think you have to somehow, in a medium defined by time, like music, you have to sort of step out of time in order to get the divine unity or transcendence or whatever your experience is. So it's like what appears to be movement turns out to be all part of the same thing. So I don't know. There's no time in those ecstatic experiences of music. But if you're listening to the development of the harmony or the counterpoint or whatever, then you're keenly aware of things, how they're positioned in time.
Right.
But, it's also interesting that often music is described in terms of colors or...
Yes, true.
Yeah. So there's a kind of inherent synesthesia.
Well, and again, the responses to this strike me as individual, cultural, and to some degree educational when I think about kinds of music that for me discloses primordial unity. I have something in various camps I guess the first thing that would come to mind is Beethoven's A minor quartet.
That's a good one. How about Jethro Tull's Passion Play?
That was going to be the next on my list. And, other than Western classical chamber music and fairly hard rock, I have the sense that if I knew more about Siberian shamanic chanting, I'd find the same things there, as well as most traditional cultures that use music to portray those things. But I couldn't take it from a dead stop. A lot of African music sounds the same to me because I don't know much about it.
Yeah, it all sounds different in a kind of similar way.
And in a kind of the same mode, but I just don't know enough about it. I trust that it's there.
I'm sure it's there.
But let's have some other voices here.
Musical voice.
Anybody still with us?
I'm thinking about poetry and how the more unity it has, the better of a poem it is. So in a good poem, it's not just the meaning and the word sounds and the rhythm of the poem and even the rhyme scheme all have to mean the same thing. And that's why, like Parashar was saying a couple of weeks ago, to write a poem that doesn't have meter and rhyme, to really be a master, to pull it off, because you have to exploit the subtler rhythms than, just set meters. And I was thinking about abstract art, which Parashar, well, she condemned modern art, not necessarily abstract art, but I always assumed that abstract art that doesn't represent something must also be the master's medium, because the painter can't rely on what he's portraying to convey meaning or emotion. It has to be done just through the shapes and the relationships between the colors and the balance of the whole painting. So, like free verse, it's very easy to produce bad abstract art and very hard to produce good abstract art.
Yeah, I like the ones that are created by blowing up a can of paint.
Yeah, that's puzzling.
Not really.
Because the artist isn't in control, so where's the composition?
Yeah.
I really don't know how to evaluate those things. I've heard people talk about sitting in front of Rothko paintings for hours until they just started weeping up the beauty, of a painting that's essentially black. So, I don't know how to index these things for other people.
I'll say that, in my opinion, abstract art is a bit like abstract jazz. I know people sometimes get it and think it's great, but for me, the stuff like Sun Ra makes my ears bleed and abstract art makes my eyes bleed, so can't really handle that. My opinion is, of course, the one true way. But, I just think that Ezra Pound said it most correctly when it comes to poetry. He said, music begins to atrophy when it departs too far from the dance. Poetry begins to atrophy when it gets too far from the music. You really cannot have good poetry without the music. You can have free verse, but that free verse needs to have some sort of internal structure that might seem relatively effortless on the part of the reader, but took a heck of a lot of effort on the part of the writer to get it to that point. Modern poetry, as in the last 50 years, does not have that. Modern music doesn't have that because it gets too far away from that physical fluidity of the body. And maybe, in my opinion, I would say music and musical poetry, can get me closer to the divine, but also conversely, it can do the opposite. If I see ugly art, it's not going to make me recoil to the extent that ugly music will. And a stuck for a law for even calling modern music music, because like techno, rap, R&B, pop, house, basically everything that now is considered music is trash and should be wiped away from the face of the earth as soon as possible.
It's interesting that you talked about music getting away from dance, because modern pop music has one rhythm, and that's the pounding heart, not the rest of the body, just that, as far as I know. And so you can dance to the same dance to any pop music, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, that pounding is what gets me. If I hear bass, if someone in my building's playing it, if I hear it in a car, I want to grab the nearest sharp object or heavy object and start smashing everything in sight. It fills me with such an immense amount of hatred and rage. And on the other hand, when I listen to something like Gregorian chants or good classical, I feel like I'm flying through the stars. It's wonderful. And it's not to say that I can't handle something with a good rhythm and good beat and something a bit heavier. I love Wagner, but the stuff that has that intense bass and pounding, it's worse for me than listening to sledgehammers.
Well, I understand. I have a different reaction to it. I often get carried away by it, and not in a bad sense. I find it kind of liberating.
I don't know. There's a invasive, inherently unpleasantness to the when you hear music and pretty much all you hear is subwoofer.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Feel the vibrations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's unsettling by its very nature because the stability of the ground you stand on and the walls of your house and everything are sort of called into question.
Because they're vibrating.
Yeah.
Well, just think about it this way. You know, the best and truest music uses sounds from nature, and so the best classical music reminds you of the symphony of the birds, bird song. What can this stuff that's using the subwoofer remind you of? A volcanic explosion, an earthquake? That's not something I want to be reminded.
Yeah, it's like trying to savor the beauty of being hit over the head repeatedly.
Is there nothing beautiful about a volcano?
Well, yes, there is.
But not when you're standing next to it.
Well, it still might be beautiful until the lava covers you, but yeah.
Okay.
I have a proposal for an art form that reveals the primordial unity of being better than music does, and that's geometric art, because you see the one in the many there better than anywhere else, because everything is completely ordered and infinitely unfolds. And there's all these patterns, but it all comes back to one thing. Everything is contained in the point in the end.
Yes, the point.
That's the point.
Angeli, I interrupted you a while back.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say that, you know, one of the reasons art, whether it's, and I don't consider music anything different than another form of art, and dance and drawings or whatever it is that falls under the category of art, is so appealing to one is because it doesn't follow any structured syntax that most languages do. And so it brings one back to that imagination that once a child had when they were born, to actually freely imagine without being constricted with the language of syntax.
Right. And without necessarily having a purpose.
Exactly, right.
I can barely remember, flights of imagination in early life, but they were just, unlike the way I experience things now.
Unlike the way you experience things now.
Yeah, because I guess mostly I'm experiencing things. But, the kind of imagination that occurs early in life is, I don't know, it's sort of like a painting or something. And it has more, what's going to come next is less anticipated. Yeah, anyway, it's pretty nice.
All right, so moving on, we have discussed music, but what about silence? What is the value of silence in one's life, and how does one find it in the midst of the insane and ever-present noise and infernal racket of the modern world?
One has to find it inside, and finding it inside, distractions of the modern world and the noises of outside become much less relevant and much less imposing.
Well, and you also experience silence kind of the way you experience space, in that all the sound takes place within silence.
Maybe that's a better way to put it. Once you see the silence for what it is, like seeing the space for what it is.
Yeah, in other words, you can't describe the space.
Right.
And if I want to say what silence is all about, I can't say. For one thing, I'll break the silence if I say, but I don't know. It's like a chair that's in a space is not the space. Anything that one might attribute to silence can just swallow it up. So it proves its superiority the way space does.
I think harmony is the key point there. I think there's not a single thing I've ever heard in nature that I find disturbing. There's no sound in nature in this time that I've been on the planet that bothers me, but artificially produced sounds that are not in harmony with the sounds of nature, i.e. modern music, is disturbing. You see, for me, it's like a very Dajalic thing because it actually prevents me from finding my inner peace. This past Saturday, someone was playing their stereo system too loud below me, and the only way I was able to find inner peace was by putting on my heaviest pair of boots and jumping up and down for a half an hour until it stopped.
Well, question, why don't you find modern classical music distasteful? Because harmony is such a new invention. I mean, harmony only goes back 1,000 years.
Yeah, but harmony's a little like geometry too.
Yeah, it came with the Renaissance.
The conception of harmony might have come with the Renaissance, but it's something that's innate in nature and has existed as the galaxy has existed.
Right. Anytime there's two or more tones, there's harmony. And the relationship between them has its own qualities, texture, that, you know, they could induce peace or they could make you grit your teeth. You know, it's like the difference between sound and noise. Ambrose Bierce, in his dictionary, described noise as a stench in the ear, which I thought was good.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I can appreciate modern classical music, but I do have to say, my criteria for a judgment of a work of art in the realm of music is something that I not only can listen to, but can listen to repeatedly. And as much as I can enjoy Philip Glass on a one-off basis, I can't listen to him repeatedly as I can with more classical composers. And yeah, I think that we moderns are missing something, and music that I find, the last period at which I can really listen to something on an ongoing basis was from the 20s and 30s, I'd say.
I have trouble filtering out noises. I have to either listen or have silence. And I never have understood people who can listen to music while they read, even if the music doesn't have words. Even if I listen to music while I drive, I tend to either not hear the music at all or lose my way, which happens to me a lot. But I think people have different abilities to filter, and maybe that's part of why bad music is so disturbing to you, Parasha. I don't know. I noticed that there are certain sounds like the rain falling that I can listen to, but it doesn't distract me or fill my mind. And sometimes when there are disturbing noises around me, I can switch my mindset and listen to them as if they were rain falling, and then they're less disturbing to me. But of course, if it's loud and shaking my house or a stench in my ear, then that's not enough.
It's interesting how we're all different, because if I had the choice, I prefer silence, even to the best music, or not absolute silence, but the silence of the natural world. But when you're, let's say, in a house or apartment, there's all these little noises, whether it's the refrigerator making a noise or a computer something, and all of those, I'm hypersensitive to them and they really bother me. So outside of the times I have something like this call going on, I'm going to be listening to something. You know, I really like the work of Anton Bruckner. But in general, it's when you're living in a modern house, there's no such thing as perfect silence. So the best I found is to have a nice low level of something classical playing, and that helps to overcome the, you know, infernal buzz of the modern world, which interestingly enough is disturbing, but I actually like the sound of bees buzzing. So again, it's something qualitatively different for me. And like I said, my experience might not be the experience of everyone, but I'm super hyped sound.
Well, you know, nature doesn't have a lot of pure silence, but it feels quiet and spacious nonetheless.
Poor God, trying to reach Anton.
You know, we've been talking about silence in terms of the lack of spoken word or something that we listen to. But we know that even though we may not be listening to anything or we may not be saying anything, there's always internal dialogue that keeps going on. And I think in many ways, internal silence, even though you're listening to something, is far more important than external silence.
My brain chatters at me all day and all night
that's-
long too.
Well, that's its job.
Mine too.
Well, well said, Angela. I think you did better than I did when I started this rap about internal silence. But I think you got it.
One thing that I found really interesting and helpful was when they improved the highway near me, turned it into a stretch of interstate, the traffic, where they also cut away a bunch of trees that block some of the sound. But it would really bother me sometimes, loud mufflerless vehicles and subwoofers going down the road, which you can hear for a mile. And I just used to get really bent out of shape. And I finally, instead, used that first taste of annoyance as a reminder to be quiet.
And not get carried away.
Yes, exactly. In other words, you don't have to react to it.
Right.
Yes.
And I tell you, a lot of the stench, left my sonic environment when I started doing that.
Good point.
And you said a very interesting point, Priscilla. Sometimes I find this with myself as well. Sometimes this outside noise that we call noise or annoyance actually acts as a trigger to create that space to be silent inwardly and to gather in a way that we otherwise wouldn't. So maybe we should not give the external noise such a hard time, because it does us favors in many other ways.
Yeah, by contrast,
Yes.
there's nothing else.
And Larry suggests having that opportunity to seize our own subjective response to this, so it doesn't put us in a state where we're distracted, or for that matter, angry, or for that matter, hostile and murderous.
Well, yeah. I mean, and I used to feel things in that area.
I've been with you when you did.
And, I was a prisoner of it.
Well said.
Why should something come along and just yank me and drag me down the road?
Why indeed?
But we all have things that go past our own personal capacity to reject them. For some people, it's the sound of other people eating. I have a couple people in my family who just cannot stand the sound of somebody else eating. It fills them with rage.
Wait a minute. Let's capture that for a moment. It fills them with
rage.
Well, now, is it the mouth sounds or is it the tableware clinking?
It's the mouth sounds, I think.
Yeah.
But they even know what part of the genome is responsible for it. So if you get your genes analyzed by one of these mail order companies, they'll tell you if you carry the gene for being annoyed by. So, we're up against a lot with our biology.
Wow, there's a genetic marker for noisy eating?
No, for being annoyed by noisy eating.
Oh, for being annoyed by it.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
But you're right. It fills me with rage is a very telling expression.
Yeah. Where's my role in all that? It fills me.
Well, but that's the experience, is being yanked around by something. And Larry, you described rejecting that and saying, no, I'm not going to be dragged. And that's fantastic if you can do it.
It took a lot of practice. It really did. And
That's what the path is about in many ways,
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. And I sort of, rounded the bend on that when I became sort of like grateful for the opportunity to detach. In other words, instead of reminding me of how much I hated that sound, it reminded me how nice it is to be free of it. So I began to welcome the sound of a subwoofer going down the road, because I could use it to prove to myself that, that's not me, and I don't have to have all those irrational feelings about it. Now, when it comes to low sounds like subwoofers, I think we're instinctively sensitive to them, and to sort of, you go on alert, if not feel actual alarm or fear, at least physiologically. And that's one of the reasons that's one of my least favorite sounds. In nature, it would be a loud sound if it's out of place. A big clap of thunder all of a sudden when you're not expecting thunder to be around is jolting. You may not be disturbed more than a second, but you'll have an invitation to fight or flight. Let's put it that way.
Yes, a response that takes place perhaps a little further down the nervous system.
Well, more in the brainstem.
Yeah, fight or flight.
Having an amygdalic reaction.
Building on that, let's get to the third question, which is also related.
Yeah.
New York City has bans on honking in certain areas, yet no bans on rap or rock music, which are even more mind-numbingly annoying and disturbing than honking. If one lives in a city or noisy area, how are they supposed to concentrate on the spiritual life when the diabolical noises of the canal jackhammers through their heads at all hours of day and night?
Well, there are noise ordinances, and people do report their neighbors and the garden parties to the police just on that basis, and the police respond.
Yeah, there's a sense in which the sound would be disturbing the peace.
Can you believe it that here they felt that noise ordinances were disproportionately affecting people of color, so they canceled them, and you can't any longer call the police on people that are playing the loud music, and it disturbed me a great.
That's awful.
Yeah, and the people below me that were playing the loud music are the whitest of the white people, but yet I can't call the police because they have banned calling the police for
right. And there's a racial stereotype implied in that, even thinking to look at the disproportionate effects on different races. It means we start with a presumption that Black people are loud, and actually culturally they are a little bit. But I don't know. They like a certain kind of music. Of course, with rap music, that's a really unfortunate connection. But there's lots of white people involved in rap music now. So, yeah, I think trying to racialize.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in another location, it might be Zydeco or country, you know?
That's right.
Or Dixieland.
It's just the assumption that...
I personally would prefer hard rock to Dixieland. Personal.
I would prefer Dixieland to a number of other things, but hard rock is better. Hard rock can have more depth, and Dixieland is kind of like a jazz thing where you don't really improvise.
Someone once observed about jazz, and I think it may have been you, Larry.
It may have been.
That jazz is music for alcohol.
Yeah.
That's what you really need to enjoy jazz.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why places have piano bars. That was my closest introduction to jazz. I was working with somebody, this guy at the uranium refinery, and he was really into jazz. And he knew I didn't share that, but I didn't hate it or anything. And he invited me to go to this bar after work one evening. And we went in there and we sat at the piano bar and listened to the jazz and sipped alcohol. It wasn't too bad, but it wasn't all that good. There's something about some jazz improvisation that puts the virtuosity above the art.
Oh, interesting.
And, you know, I mean, there are people that take off on a solo lick and really do some amazing things. And there are others that you just wish they'd quit. And, you know, I think in one case, the person is moved by the music, and in the other case, maybe one is moved by a sense of self. I don't know. There are improvisations that seem to belong, and there are improvisations that seem to take one's attention almost completely from the music.
Good description.
I still don't care for jazz, although Take 5 was great.
Yes, and you know why it's called Take 5.
Yes, I do. It has something in common with Gustav Holst and Mars. The Mars section in The Planets, which is in 5 rhythm.
Yes, 5/4, yes. Now, I have known musicians, or maybe academics, I've known musicians who have said they've studied classical music all their lives, but it wasn't until they really got into music theory that they became interested in jazz.
Yeah, there are a lot of people in music school who are drawn to jazz, you know, in our wonderful world-renowned music school here.
That's right.
And yeah, I knew a woman who played the double bass, and, you know, a lot of her playing was jazz.
I swear that sounds like the first line of a limerick.
Yes, I once knew a woman who played bass.
She had a strange look on her face.
That's right.
Go on.
Then, as in now, and I really don't know how, I had the word I wanted and it disappeared. She vanished without a trace.
I was going to say the technique took away her taste.
I was going to say she flew like a rocket to space.
Well, why not?
So, what were you saying before we hijacked this response? You once knew it was...
Oh, yeah. The thing is that a lot of her playing was jazz, you know, on little gigs here and there, and probably needed the money, but still, she was really comfortable with it. And I remember when I was in the Ohio University Symphony, which I didn't really belong there, but it was great.
And you played bass, right?
Yes, I played bass. And there were a couple of people that played along with me who, you know, in that pre-concert time where everybody's tuning up and stuff, they would do, you know, little jazz things. So I don't know. I've just never seen the bass as a percussion instrument, which apparently it is in bass. I mean, not only that, but serves that function.
Interesting. I can see how that would happen.
Yeah, it's more about rhythm than it is melody.
Right. Yes. Jazz is all about rhythm.
Except when it isn't.
Except when it is, I suppose. Yeah.
Some of these more adventurous styles. I heard some modern jazz. It maybe isn't modern anymore, given how old I am. But I felt like I was being, like I had a hornet swarming around my head, or, you know, just the room is full of birds and they keep flying and they're all around me and up close. And I don't mind being near birds as a general rule, but it was the overwhelming aspect of it. The musicians would just take off and play fast with quick diversions, or that's not the right word, you know, into the really high range, and, you know, make their instruments squeak for a while, or, I mean, and there was no discernible melody. It was all pure improvisation. And it was like chaotic. Anyway, I really, I didn't feel good listening to that. So I didn't. I mean, the melody disappears and there's no place for harmony in some of those riffs. So yeah, there are things that disappoint me about jazz.
Right, I understand.